One of you guys actually recommended I read the book High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And I'm so glad you did because this was definitely a 5-star read for me. I've added it to my Amazon storefront, so I'll pop that below this video if any of you guys want to check it out, which you definitely should. Basically, the premise of this book is that conflict is generally a good thing. It can be a catalyst for change, it can be a necessary interaction for us to improve as people, but there is a specific type of conflict, which she calls high conflict, that creates a lot of division between people and leads to some of the worst aspects of humanity, such as hate crimes, war, genocide, and so forth. And in states of high conflict, people start to fall for this us versus them mentality, and they explain their frustrations as a justifiable response to the other side's initial aggression, which starts this cycle of aggression where somehow both sides feel like they are reacting defensively even when they're not. Now, this can certainly apply to politics, but also on much smaller scales. Neighborhood hostilities, family drama, going through a divorce. So in this video, I'm going to run through 7 takeaways that I took from this book so that if you yourself find yourself in a high conflict situation, which I'm sure you do, it seems like we're all embroiled in at least one type of high conflict in our lives, you have a better idea of how to disentangle yourself from the vicious cycle. But again, I'm just covering 7 points from this book, so I do highly recommend that you read it for yourself. Also, my second novel, A Song at Dead Man's Cove, is officially set to release this June 2025. It's a gothic horror novel. Make sure you are subscribed to my email newsletter at drannayuden.com so that you can be alerted as soon as it's out. Without further ado, let's talk about toxic conflict. My number one takeaway from this book is that when you're experiencing a place of high conflict, it is really important to try to understand what is underneath the other person's perspective and to really come at it from a place of curiosity. So Amanda Ripley talks about a divorce attorney who does things very differently from other divorce attorneys. Instead of pitting people against each other, he tries to help them understand each other. So he'll ask them things like, what is one thing that you understand about your husband's point of view? He's basically trying to get below the surface to the meat of what people actually care about, something he calls going down the why trail, where you continuously ask people, and why? Why is that important to you? And why do you care about it? And why do you value that? Until eventually you get at the core of the issue. And this involves a lot of active reflective listening, where you try to paraphrase and clarify what people are saying, basically giving them an opportunity to correct any incorrect assumptions that you're making about their perspective. I think this is really important. In this day and age, we make so many assumptions about people, and it is such a rare thing to find a person who actually says, no, you know what, let me ask you. Is this what you're saying? Because this is the way I'm interpreting it. And if I'm interpreting it wrong, I'd like for you to correct me. And if you have nothing else to say, one really simple thing that you can say to get a person talking more about what's really at the core of the issue is to just ask them, tell me more about that. So she talks about how there was a study by Finkel and colleagues where they told 60 married couples to spend 7 minutes a day writing about a recent fight from the perspective of a neutral third party who wants what's best for everyone involved. And then they asked them to think about that person's perspective during their next fight. And they did this 4 times over the course of a year. The couples that did this reported feeling less upset about their fights, and their conflict didn't end up causing a dip in marital satisfaction like it did for the other couples. So the moral of the story here, I think, is you need to empathize with the other person to sort of introject the perspective of a caring third party who wants what's best for everyone, instead of just always thinking about it from the perspective of what would be good for me. And this is really important because when people don't feel heard, they get defensive and they in turn stop listening. So it's in your best interest to make sure that other people feel heard when you are in conflict with them. Number 2, whatever you do, don't shame the other person, because once you have shamed them, you've all but cemented high conflict. Amanda says one thing that I highlighted. People who expect acceptance and instead encounter rejection tend to react with more hostility. This very much parallels a quote by Nelson Mandela that she quotes. There's nobody more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly. There's a pattern to how people respond to shame and social rejection. Typically, they start to fawn, where they'll try to, ingratiate themselves back into the group. And when that doesn't work, they start to get very aggressive, which ironically only makes the social rejection worse. And we also know from studies that humiliation is one of the biggest precursors for revenge. For example, I remember reading in a different book recently that when asked about if they've ever fantasized about ending somebody else's life, almost all people will talk about contexts where they felt humiliated or shamed by that person. And a concept that I think relates to this is contempt. We know also from John Gottman's research into conflicts in marriages that contempt is the relationship killer. Once you feel contempt for someone, the marriage is all but doomed. So all of these things, shaming people, humiliating them, expressing contempt towards them, playing the blame game with them, are going to really heighten the conflict and make things a lot worse, not just for them, but also for you. It's okay to disagree with people, it's okay to be angry with people, but don't resort to hate, because that's when you're at risk of dehumanizing them. And once you've dehumanized someone, you can justify pretty much anything. Number 3, this one is particularly for group settings. Erase the binary as much as possible. So if you only have 2 groups, whether it's at work, in politics, in your family, that makes it way easier to cement in people's minds that there's my group and there's the other group. There's us and there's them. On the other hand, having more than 2 groups allows people to shift to the mindset that there's my group, them, and other them. And it gets a lot harder to draw these harsh cognitive lines between good and evil, because you recognize that, hey, it's not that simple. There are actually more categories than just good and evil. Also, having only 2 groups gives people the impression that life is a zero-sum game. One group wins and the other loses, which creates a lot more resentment for people. Whereas having more than 2 groups allows people not to feel like the loser, but maybe a loser out of several, which is no longer as personal. It's a lot easier of a pill to swallow. So as much as possible, if you're doing teamwork or splitting up into different types of groups, make sure it's more than 2. Erase the binary. Number 4. Challenge yourself to hold the complexity. So Amanda Ripley talks about contact theory, which is the idea that the more you are exposed to people, the more you come into contact with them, the harder it becomes to feel prejudice for them and to sort of build a caricature of them in your mind, to reduce them to very black and white categories. And that is part of the issue with very insulated groups where there's not a lot of interaction with people who are different from them, is they get more and more radicalized and they completely lose touch with the other group's humanity. Instead, what you want to do is what the lawyer that I mentioned earlier called holding the tension, which is basically leaning into contrast. For instance, smiling at people who dislike you, acknowledging something that you dislike about a person and then acknowledging something that you like about them too, pointing out contradictions in what people are saying something that you agree with and then also saying something that you disagree with about what a person's saying. And another type of contrast that comes from Gottman's research is the idea of the magic relationship ratio, the 5-to-1 ratio of 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction that you must have if you don't want that relationship to disintegrate. So what this means in terms of high conflict is you can't just have the negative aspects of it. You have to also sometimes joke around, laugh with each other, smile at each other, give someone a compliment or, brush them on the arm if they're your partner, for instance. Even during conflict, because that really disarms the other person and it reminds them that you're not the enemy, and it builds up that ratio so that the relationship can outlast the conflict. And doing all of this, being able to hold the complexity, will lead you to become a person who can hold multiple realities at once, rather than simply putting people into very black and white boxes. For instance, I have a friend, they might be watching this video. They probably know who they are. I think they know who they are. This friend, I can never tell where they're going to land on an issue, and I love that about them. Sometimes even within the same topic, they'll be going in one direction and then kind of change gear. I love that. I think that that's so valuable, and it's such an example of being able to hold the complexity of life, to live in the contrast, to live in the tension. Number 5, if you can't find common ground in one area of life, try to appeal to that person's other area of life where you do have something in common. This could refer to identities, this could refer to values, it could refer to a specific issue. People are not one-dimensional. We are all extremely multifaceted. We hold a multitude of identities at every given point. So you therefore don't just have to appeal to one thing about this person, you can appeal to many different aspects of their identity. If you're trying to win them over during high conflict, instead of thinking about just one aspect where you don't fall on the same page, think about something that you do have in common and appeal to that instead. For example, let's say that someone at work has a problem with you for some reason, but both of you are parents. So you ask them about their children. That builds rapport. And one really important way to find common ground with people is to work towards a common goal. So maybe that common goal during a high conflict is, hey, let's find the best possible compromise where we are both as happy as possible. And let's start from there. Number 6, learn to speak their language. Amanda Ripley talked about how liberals and conservatives tend to have different political values. And what often ends up happening is they talk at each other instead of appealing to the other person's values or language. So for example, liberals will try to get conservatives to care about the planet rather than using language that might better appeal to them, like protecting the purity of the planet. And most people, she says, aren't willing to change around their language to better appeal to the other person. So try to get in the habit of really asking yourself, what is the other person trying to communicate through their language? How can I appeal more to that? How can I speak their language rather than speaking my own language, speaking about what I value? On a very simple surface level, this can literally mean using the same words as them. If someone's saying, I just feel really unheard, reiterating that, saying, I hear you, you feel unheard, or feeling heard is important to you. But on a deeper level, you want to get at what's the value underneath the language. Because again, language communicates cultural and personal values. And lastly, number 7, be careful who you surround yourself with. Amanda Ripley talks about how there are fire starters, people who put fuel on your high conflicts, and then there are fire extinguishers, people who help you slow down during periods of high conflict to make healthier decisions. Fire starters tend to be very quick to validate your self-righteousness, to encourage you to respond more aggressively, to turn off your empathy for the out group, to vilify people, whereas fire extinguishers often encourage nuance, accountability, and compassion. And families often act as fire extinguishers. For example, parents are more likely to leave violent situations than non-parents because they're thinking about their children. And she says it also helps when some kind of respected authority supports the reconciliation. So for example, if you're having a conflict at work, stay away from the people who seem to be trying to make it worse. Lean into the support of people who want the best for everyone involved. And for example, having like a boss or a supervisor try to reconcile you and the other person you're having a problem with can be really helpful. Again, definitely check out this book. It was a really, really important read, probably my favorite one so far this year. I hope you're having a lovely week, and I'll see you soon.